this week we're looking at character development because you can't have a great story without its characters developing. And so we're looking at this concept of character development all month long. And the thing is, one of the things that brings a person hope is to see change. And one of the things that gets them rooted in the fact that hope can exist is when they see change in themselves. And transformation is such an important part of our Christian journey. Us changing and us growing is an important part of us being a Christian. So we're looking at the different characteristics of character development that we think is important for developing hope. Today we're going to talk about gratitude. And, gratitude is one of those, I would say it's a characteristic, but I think a lot of people think of it as a reaction or an emotional reaction to something going well. And I want to disabuse us of that notion right now, all right? Because I think the idea of character is something that has to be established outside of the circumstance of any sort of emotive factors, okay? We are what we are. A character is built. We are who we are regardless of the circumstances around us. Circumstances actually reveal at the deepest level at times who we actually are. When we're alone, when things don't go well. And gratitude is one of those things. People with high character, people rooted, people who have great integrity are able to demonstrate gratitude regardless of the circumstances of life. And that's what we're going to look at. I remember I'd gone to a conference. My wife and I got married in 1998. I had graduated that month. I got married that month. And then right after our honeymoon, we came back and we went to this great big campus conference. And there were, thousands of students and campus ministers at this conference. And we were all, just talking about changing the world. I mean, this was the passion of the youth. And I remember there were people and students coming from all over the world, and we were discussing, how can we make a difference on our campuses? And they had divided us into these little D groups. And so I was with international campus ministers from all over the world. And I was really excited because one of the people in my group was a campus minister in mainland China, okay? And he was part of one of our underground churches. Our churches were illegal in China. And so he had to give me a name that was not his name that he went by during the conference. He couldn't tell me what city he was from. He couldn't tell me anything about the church. He could just tell me about some of the circumstances of it. And I remember him and I got some time to get together to pray and talk. And I was like, I really want to talk to this guy about, what they're doing. And I would love to tell him about what we're doing. And I remember we're talking, and I'm just, I'm 22 years old at the time. And I'm just like, here are some of the frustrations of trying to build campus ministry. And here are some of the things that we're trying to do, and we share our faith. And and he just kind of looked melancholy at the time. He's like, I'm sorry. I probably need your help right now. I'm feeling a little bit down right now. And I was like, oh, well, what can I do? He's like, well, I've been separated from my wife for about 5 months because the police came to our house looking for me, so I had to go on the run, and I've been living on the run in Mongolia for the last 5 months to escape the police. And I'm like listening to the story of him just being on the run, and he can't wait to get back to his family, and he's hoping in the next month he's going to be able to go back. And it was just, at that point it puts all of your own complaints into perspective, right? I felt silly. I felt dumb for ever mentioning anything that I was struggling with as this man who hasn't seen his family for months and is hoping to be able to get back home without having to go to prison is telling me about his life. And here's the thing that we discover about the lack of gratitude, all right? And this is going to be one of the points today, is that the lack of gratitude makes us really stupid, all right? And I think that when we're insulated in a world that we all are, where we're surrounded by wealth, we are surrounded by security, and all of that becomes invisible to us after a while. It's funny, when things go right, everything that's going right becomes invisible. The only things that become visible is what's going wrong. All right, that's why when you do a good job, hopefully nobody notices you. People notice you when things are oftentimes going badly. All right, but that's what happens when you live in a place that's so easy to live in, is that everything that's good becomes unnoticeable anymore. All right, and we are constantly in danger of that because of where we live. And we can always look at people around us and compare ourselves to them, because, when rich people compare themselves to other rich people, it seems silly to everybody else in the world. But that's often what we're doing. All right, and so we need to talk about this idea of us developing a character, a strong character of gratitude. to help root us in the hope that we actually do have. And I think it's interesting because gratitude is one of these virtues that often gets overlooked. It's not, well, for lack of a better term, it's not sexy, all right? We're not talking about bravery or courage, the things that get people in movies, the things that get people in the news, all right? We often talk about humility, and that's a characteristic that we often talk about because the lack of humility gets us in so much professional trouble at times. It gets us in so much familial trouble at times. It just gets us in relational difficulty. And so we often talk about humility because the lack of it directly impacts our lives so much of the time. And we talk about kindness because we live in this harsh world. But perhaps our great blind spot for us in the civilization that we're living in the nation that we're living in, our blind spot may be the lack of gratitude. This seems ironic given the fact that we live within such an obviously blessed world. You would think that we would be some of the first to be grateful, to express gratitude, to remember what we have. But it's part of our society to overlook such things. It would be one thing to grow up truly impoverished. And when I say truly impoverished, you don't know when your next meal is going to come. All right, that's the type of poverty that so many billions of people in the world live with, okay? We don't even really relate to that. Like when we get between meals and it's snack time, we'll say things like, I'm starving right now. I could go for a graham cracker, or... All right, but when you grow up impoverished around almost an entirely impoverished people, and then you find yourself within a warm home with a comfortable bed and eating 3 squares a day, well, then you feel real grateful. But if you don't live that way, you kind of forget about gratitude. It's another thing to grow up with the benefits that we have, surrounded by other people with the same benefits, and some people that even have more benefits. We grow accustomed to comfort and security, like I mentioned. Do you know what speech I always hated growing up? And if you've been alive, you've heard this speech before. The I didn't have what you had when I was your age speech. It's funny, that speech never made me feel grateful. I think it was intended to make me feel grateful for what I have, but it really just felt like a catharsis for the person that was talking to me, all right? I was usually resentful of that type of rhetoric. There was a part of me that said, yeah, and every generation going back to Adam said that same speech to the next generation. It's a common fact that reducing the trials of one generation to the petty complaining by comparison to the burdens of the hardships of the previous generation will not engender any kind of gratitude in anybody. Walking to school 3 miles in the snow, both ways, uphill. It's the fish story that has no means of verification, It's an oppressive form of boasting. It isn't inspiring, it's tiring. That being said, it's hard for me not to think that we are increasingly a less grateful people. What is worse is that our salvation hangs on the balance of our gratitude in many ways. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Romans chapter 1. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that this is a pretty brutal verse that we're going to read. This is one of those times where Paul is writing something. It's these verses that we sometimes don't like to read in public. We recognize the truth of it in our private moments, but it's awkward sometimes to read in a pluralistic society with divided values. Starting in verse 18, it says this: the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. So their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than their Creator, who was ever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relationships for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these things, but they also approve of those who practice them. Okay. Wow. The one thing I do like about this, I think to me it's I shouldn't say funny, but it definitely stands out to me, is after all of like the murder, the malice, the strife, the sexual impurity, they go at the very end and they disobey their parents. It's funny what types of premiums we put on sins. I mean, Paul was like, they sleep around, they're crazy, they've lost their minds. You get this, they don't even obey their parents. This verse seems to describe the very decline of our own Western civilization when you look at it. Paul says that the individuals to whom he is referring they will one day suffer God's wrath if they don't change. They become futile in their thinking. You know, there's a difference between human and divine wrath. I mean, I think that has to be pointed out here, because when we hear divine wrath, there's a lot of criticism that we can leverage towards God at having wrath, at exercising wrath. But there's a difference between human wrath and divine wrath. Human wrath is always self-centered. It's always focused on vengeance. It's always focused on self-hurt. It is I am feeling hurt, and because I feel hurt, I'm going to hurt others. It's self-motivated. Likely what's being described here is an eschatological description of wrath, something that is coming towards the end, that is building presently and coming at the end. But it's not a wrath that's malicious. It's a wrath that's righteous. And there's a difference there. He says that the people that he's describing became darkened in their hearts, darkened in their thinking. It seems that at this point, they become victims, or rather willful participants in the depravity of the world all around them. This is who Paul is describing. He even points out that though they recognize the truth about God, though in their innermost mind and heart, they can't help but recognize the truth of the existence of God, they continue in their way of life and further dig their own grave by approving that others do the same thing. You know, it's interesting to know the truth about a thing and ignore the knowledge. You know, it's something we all recognize and relate to with one another. Last night I was on my way. We had a young professional devotional last night, and it'd been such a busy day, and I had not eaten anything. And so on the way there, I was like, I just got to get something to eat. And I see a McDonald's, and I don't like McDonald's. There's like a part of me that craves it for some reason, but I know that every time I have it, I regret it. Every time. There's never been a time I've eaten McDonald's where I was like, wow, that was good. My body is telling me that's right. What you just did right there, what you just took into you is right. It's natural, it's healthy, it's good for you. This is what the body needs. Every time, every single time my body goes, what are you doing? What is this? What did you just put in me? This is plastic? What is this? Is this carpet? Are you eating carpet right now? But I do it anyway because I'm hungry. I like the taste of it. My body hates everything else about it. And I know that's going to happen every time, but I do it. Why? I have no idea, because I'm human, because I'm a moron, all right? There's so many things we recognize the truth of that we ignore over and over again. We know that the words that we're about to say, we're going to regret. I mean, how many times have you been in an argument with someone and your spouse, and the words are coming out of your mouth, and there's a part of your brain that's going, no, come back, trying to reel it back in, but it just comes out anyway. And you know, like a day later, you're like, why? Why? Why did I say that? I'm still paying for that. All I had to do is just shut up. Just be quiet. But we say it anyway. We know that there are things that we're addicted to that we need to stay away from. We can't even go near. It's not just we can't participate in it, we need to stay away from it completely. And yet, we dabble. We get too close. It's one of the seemingly enigmatic follies of humankind. I remember, for those of you who remember Blockbuster, before their great collapse, there was a show on television for many years called 24. Do you guys remember that show? And, we didn't really have television. We had television, but we didn't have cable. We didn't have any reception. We lived out in the country in Illinois, so we just didn't watch anything. But we did watch movies. And I remember people kept telling us, you got to watch 24. And I was like, well, I don't really have an ability to watch it. And then all of a sudden they started releasing television shows as series at Blockbuster. And that was novel. Like they'd never done that before. And I was like, well, let's watch 24. And so we watched, they was already like in the 4th season, so we started watching it. And 24 is one of those shows, like every single show, they end, you're like, you can't do that. You can't end like that. And so watching it week to week would have been absolute torture, but having the whole series, it's a different matter, all right? It was like crack, okay? We would pop it in and we'd say to each other, we're just gonna watch one episode. One episode. Every disc came with 4 episodes. All right? We had little kids, so we're in the ministry, so we couldn't even watch anything until starting at like 10 p.m. anyway. And we'd watch it, and I knew in the back of my mind it was going to happen. We're going to do this whole disc. We're going to say one episode, and then we're going to go to bed at 2 a.m. having watched the whole disc. And every time we do it. The whole disc. And then the next, you want to return it and get the next disc, but we knew it was going to happen. But we'd say it out loud, we're just going to watch one this time, even though we knew that wasn't going to be what we did. It's kind of a thing about living. We ignore certain truths that we know to be true. Of course, what Paul is discussing is infinitely more significant than that. He's talking about those who could become enemies of God, despite their knowledge of what they know to be true. Those who would turn their backs on the light and walk into the night, which always welcomes you with open arms. It's an insanity. Yet Paul ascribes a source to such behavior in such forms as the loss of gratitude. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. So in their thinking, they became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. For most of our human histories, humans have come to define who they are by something outside of themselves. I am what I am because of my mythology that I believe. Well, they didn't think it was a mythology, but as we look back, I am what I am because the nation state tells me what I am. I am what I am because my faith tells me what I am. The Renaissance began to change all of that. This newer phenomenon that grew in the Renaissance has been rapidly progressing in the last 50 years, where people no longer define themselves from an outside force or entity, but simply define themselves through their own internal forces. I am what I feel. I am what I think. I am what I say I am. And the subjectivity of this is so erratic because of how easily swayed and volatile the human mind and heart is, that we are now seeing some truly bizarre results. My kids tell me, and I mean no disrespect by mentioning this. I do not say this in any sort of condescending way, but there are humans that are now identifying as animals because it's what they want. It's what they feel in that moment. And so they identify, and it's known as being a furry, I guess, in high schools. At least that's what my kids tell me. And then they expect the world to bend to their wishes, because we can't live in a world or in a society that does not validate what we say we are. The point is that when we use the wrong outside entity or our own internal inclinations to define who we are and what we are, it is the sign that we are entering into depravity. Paul is saying that this is the natural conclusion of not recognizing God and not giving him thanks. When we lose our gratitude, we eventually turn our backs upon the truth, upon God, and we are on the road to depravity. As a matter of fact, it seems Paul consistently teaches the churches to remain grateful as a way of warding off evil. Ephesians 5:15-20 says this, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Sing and make music to your heart, in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God, the Father, for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." Colossians 1:9-4, "For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you and asking God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through spiritual wisdom and understanding. And we pray this in order that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and may please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and joyfully giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." It's interesting that in these verses, there's always a correlation between wisdom, between knowledge, and between gratitude. Conversely, it seems that there's a relationship between ingratitude, between foolishness, and between a darkened way of thinking. Ingratitude makes us dumb. When we lose our gratitude, we lose our minds. Let me give you an example of how complaining and ingratitude literally makes us dumb. I remember I think I was in Budapest, and we were there. We brought up some students over there to minister some of the campuses, and we'd gone to this monument. Some of the disciples in Budapest were taking us around to some of their monuments in the city, and I remember looking at everything's written in Hungarian, obviously, and Hungarian is pretty much voted, amongst linguists, one of the top three most difficult languages to learn. I guess it's Chinese, Polish, and Hungarian are the three languages that are most difficult to learn. Anyway, we're sitting there, and all these monuments have plaques, but they're written in Hungarian. And I remember looking at what was going on, and there was a woman, or a young woman. I didn't know her, but she was standing there. I could just hear her, and I was just trying not to look at her. But she was complaining that the monuments weren't written in English. And they're like, "What are they thinking? Like, how are we supposed to read this? Like, what's the point of having this if you can't read it?" And here's the thing. Obviously, this is a person who has grown up having certain things catered to them their entire lives. So much so that they lose track of the catering that they're getting. So much so that when they go somewhere else, they expect that same level of catering. So much so that they make a total fool of themselves in these other places. This is where the lack of gratitude makes us stupid. It's almost as though ingratitude narrows your ability to understand the world around you and only allows you to see the world through the lens of your own limited and insubstantial perspective. Of course, you will not stick out as long as you are around like-minded, ignorant, and self-absorbed beings. Yet you become something to be pitied or despised by others. Pitied by the ones who hold on to gratitude, despised by the world you choose to ignore, overlook, or disregard as irrelevant. My point is that ingratitude makes you stupid and eventually reviled. It makes you dumb, and it makes you something to be despised. Yet many people simply choose to be grateful. And this is where gratitude can't simply be a mode of reaction for us. It has to be something that we choose. Paul was grateful. Paul died a pauper. He was continually persecuted, mistreated, mistrusted. He was beaten, he was flogged, he was stoned. He was arrested, and he was jailed over and over and over again. He had to prove himself faithful to those whom he poured out his life time and time again. He's writing letters to people who he poured out his life for, that he risked his life for, and he's having to prove his motives with them. And yet, he was grateful. He lost everything in this world, and yet he chose to be grateful. And he said so very often. He said why he was grateful, how he was grateful. It was because he had spiritual stuff inside of him that allowed him to be grateful. I don't think that's the reason. He chose to be grateful. In the same way that others choose to forget God and choose to be ungrateful, Paul chose to be grateful. And I see this so often in people. Those who choose to be grateful versus those who choose not to be grateful. I can tell you exactly what it looks like to those who aren't grateful because I've been there so many times myself. It begins by looking at others' victories and asking why everything always goes their way. It continues by seeing how easy other people's lives are in comparison to yours. It builds to the observation of your own seemingly endless trials and setbacks by comparison to the easy path that everybody else has. It begins finishing by developing a kind of superiority complex because you have to deal with real problems while others have opportunities just handed to them. And it gets uglier and uglier and uglier. Now you have to ask yourself, have you had such thoughts in your own mind? At the workplace, amongst your siblings, your spouse? The hard part about this is that sometimes there's truth there, right? It's not like every one of those thoughts is completely false. But it's mostly an ignorant, backwards, and myopic way to think about life. The reality is that some people seem to have life easier because they rejoice in what they have rather than lamenting in what they don't have. When people love what they have, when they're vocal about their love for what they have, to everybody else, it just seems like, oh yeah, they're so lucky, look at them. Look how much they love that. If I had that, I'd be happy too. Those who are grateful often seem to have an easier life. It's true. When you're grateful, you make life look easier. People who are ungrateful make life look hard. But grateful people choose it. It's not because they have an easier life. It's because they choose to live a gracious life. I think we got to start recognizing what we do have. We got to force ourselves into gratitude. And I tell you what, some of us just need to travel a little bit. You just need to go somewhere else. Go live in someone else's shoes. There's a lot of ways to do that. Go volunteer. Go hang around with people who have much less than you. All right, understanding that the people here in our country who have much less have much more than most people in other countries that have much less. All right, and again, it's not a comparison game, but it tells you where you are right now, what God has done for you, the security that you have. We have so much to be joyful about. We have so much to be grateful for. You don't need to feel bad about it, but you should be grateful for it. I'll tell you what, grateful people are fun to be around. Ungrateful people are not fun to be around. There are always the people that ruin the cycle of stories when you're sitting around with your friends. You know, everyone's telling stories, and you have the one person that ruins it because their story just stinks. And they're stinky storytellers oftentimes because they're just not grateful. That might be a leap I'm making right now. I don't know. That feels true to me. But I do say this, ungrateful people are not fun to hang around. They're not fun to be around. They're a terrible witness for Jesus. Much has been given to us. You may not always feel like life is easy, and that's fair. That is. But the Christian way allows us a path every single time to find joy again, to choose gratitude once again. Because in the end, we've been given everything. We may lose much in this world, and yet we've gained everything overall. We've got to hold on to that, and people need to see that from us. Our neighbors need to see that from us. They need to see a gracious way of living. They need to see us choose gratitude. And please, if you're not going to be grateful, understand that you're going to be stupid then. So if, at the very least, choose gratitude so you're not choosing stupidity. God loves grateful people. I find that he gives grateful people more. I'm not saying more material goods. I'm not saying an easier life, but more life. Let's choose to be grateful as a part of our character development so that we can hold on to hope and teach others to do the same. Thank you very much. Have a great morning.